everybody, Beat Zimmerman here. Today's topic is PBN Naming and Charting. We recently had a live webinar in which we had several people from around the world where we discussed the history of the naming of area navigation approaches and why we're doing the change that is currently happening throughout the world with the approach chart names. So here is the webinar uncut and raw for you. I hope you like it and find it useful. Did I hear that right? Did he just say uncut and raw? No, of course not. I did edit that video for you. One more thing before that film starts. If you wonder why in the top right corner there's a picture of me that shows me very partly only most of the time, or just like, this part of my face. The reason is that when I record this into the cloud, I cannot record all the cameras. Today we use 2 cameras, so I could be seen from 2 perspectives, and it would only record the camera that is connected to my audio. So that gives a little bit of a funny impression of that I was not always in the picture, but of course the people that join live, they can see me from different angles.
All right, guys, good morning. Thanks for joining. We had about 60, I think, registered. Right now we have 44 in the room. They probably forgot. We will see. Maybe they show up. But I think it's fair to start. Why do I do this? Short answer, because I can. And the long answer is because a recent student of mine said I should maybe produce a film for the YouTube channel about the PBN naming and charting and the change of the PBN naming that is currently ongoing through the world. And as all these home office times and travel ban times came up, I thought, instead of just shooting a film, why don't we do something live so I can keep touch base with the people out there? So here we are. So as said, it's about an hour. I'm not going to make you cartographer or anything. It's just about some historical information, which is typically missing in this whole package that people are talking about now about the name change in performance-based navigation. I've been there for a while, so I saw the whole evolution of the naming and why the naming eventually was the way it was and why it's going to be the way it's going to be. So here we go. First of all, the reference of PANS-OPS is part 3, section 5, chapter 1. This is not necessarily giving you much other than this is what was applicable and this is what's going to be applicable, and that's about it. But why we arrive at the point where we are today, that's obviously not visible in that chapter. If we look at the history, at the very beginning of area navigation, everybody thought there were approaches possible with all nav sensors. So I did my first course at Bellbrook College with the old and one and only Red Callaway. Basically, that was Mr. PANS-OPS in the Times in 1995. And so this was about area navigation approaches, and at the time there were criteria for using VOR DME as a sensor, DME DME as a sensor, and GNSS as a sensor. And the titles, as you can see on the chart here, or on the schematic charts, the titles were RNAV VOR DME runway 14, RNAV DME DME runway 14, RNAV GNSS runway 14, if one specific sensor for this particular approach was going to be used. But already at that time it was said more than one sensor could be used. And then you had this mayhem in the title about saying what sensors are allowed. So if VOR DME and DME would have been allowed, the title was RNAV VOR DME, DME DME runway 14. If all of them were allowed, you had to put all of them in the brackets. So you had VOR DME, DME DME, GNSS in the brackets. So the title became extremely large. Nobody knew at the time, or nobody was aware that with this concept, But this concept would result in a problem, especially at low altitudes, because we have radio horizons that can be calculated with the formula 1.23 times the square root of the height. In this formula, radio horizon would be nautical miles, height would be feet, which logically means that the lower you are, the less coverage you can get from one particular station. And that even does not consider any masking of the terrain or anything, other phenomena that are associated with radiomagnetic waves. But just the theoretic horizon that's possible by these signals is very limited at low altitudes. Eventually, it dawned on the people that, hey, wait a minute, this could eventually be a little bit of a limiting factor, because if you do VOR DME as a nav sensor, how can you guarantee there is sufficient coverage at low altitudes? How many reference stations would you define? How would you know which reference stations are used by the system? How would you know it actually uses the ones that you thought it would use, and so on and so forth? Here on the screen, you also have an old example from Bangkok that was a VOR DME or GNSS area navigation approach. I don't think that exists anymore, but this is an old chart that I found somewhere. When you go to the DME sensor, same thing, because we know this graphic from PANSOPS, which shows us the possible update zones. So it shows us, number one, the geometrical update zones that the avionics specifications foresee, and that is any angle between 30 degrees and 150 degrees. Any smaller than 30, any greater than 150 is not possible to actually get a update from two specific stations. Plus the DME Horizon, which is very limited at low altitudes. Same problem there. And even less in a DME situation, you can tell what stations is the onboard system going to use for the navigation. Let alone for those two nav sensors, the accuracy is not incredible. So approaches flown with these sensors would not be highly accurate, even if you have an availability and a continuity of the nav system. People eventually followed from these problems that maybe it was not such a good idea to think everything's possible when flying approaches. And it came to the fact that GNSS then was the only viable nav sensor for approaches. And this was the moment where this title was born, RNAV brackets GNSS runway 14. This was way before PBN. This was, when people didn't even know what PBN would eventually mean. RNAV at this time was a short or a term for area navigation. The lines of minima that were in principle already back then possible was an LNAV line of minimum, which is the non-precision approach, and the LNAV VNAV, which is the APV barrow with barometric guidance from the onboard system. LPV was then the designation for SPAS with vertical guidance, today possible in an APV1 or in a Cat 1 performance. Back then, by no means. Eventually, the PBN concept was then brought into life, and the PBN concept obviously had some positive effects. One was that this whole implementation of area navigation was now driven on international level from ICAO. Before, we had a little bit of this entity does this, the other entity does that. So we had the Eurocontrol concepts of stepping into area navigation. We had the FAA concept stepping into area navigation. They were not necessarily the same. Eventually, this was managed on a global level, which was good. So we have the navigation capability on top, and then the PBN concept as a subgroup. And then we have en route applications, we have terminal airspace applications, and we have approach applications. And by no means, of course, we have the same requirements for these three. So for approach applications, it was decided to define a navigation specification called RMP approach, which is uniquely flown with GNSS. Of course, it gives exceptions in the nav spec itself, but it is relatively difficult to achieve the accuracy of RMP 0.3 with something like DME at low altitudes for the reasons I told you before. Then we have the RMP AR approach, which is the second approach nav spec. Advanced RMP is a nav spec that's going to be used on all approach segments except for the final. If this is not reflected in the ICAO documentation, the reason is because this is being updated currently. So fact of the matter is RMP approach flown with GNSS, RMP1 in initial, intermediate, and missed. RMP 0.3 in the final. AR then with the additional requirements today, again, maybe not reflected in the current manual, but in the update, you will see a mandatory capability of RF flag, possibility to use them in the final approach. Advanced RMP, same thing, mandatory carriage of RF flags, mandatory capability of RMP holdings. Also, they are doing some changes. There was a discussion to use 0.3 as a standard accuracy on all phases of flight. Now, I hope that gets true because that's going to help implementing advanced RMP in the future. So that concept for approaches is clear. The problem when the PBN concept was put into place, where all of a sudden we had RMP nav specs and RNAV nav specs, and the difference only being the performance monitoring and alerting requirement for RMP. RNAV term all of a sudden became no longer the abbreviation for area navigation. It now has a specific meaning, which is a bit funny because we used RNAV for ages as an abbreviation for area navigation. Now, if you use RNAV, it has a specific meaning. So what to do with the chart names in this regard? Obviously, a little bit of confusion was already programmed because the issue was then, okay, we take an RMP approach nav spec. The chart name historically was always RNAV GNSS, runway 14. The nav specs RMP approach. And then there's a third component, that's the FMS display. And FMS displays are not standardized, but typically they would show something like RNV 14, as you can see in the snapshot that I have there with RNV 26. Something like that you would see on the FMS display. So the pilot has a chart that says RNAV GNSS runway 14. He's trying to find that in the FMS. This one says RNV 14, and he was sometimes in the training told that this is an RMP approach. Now, if this is not confusing, what is then, right? RMP AR, even worse. RMP AR, chart name, RNAV, brackets, RMP, runway 14, which is in itself now in the new concept a total contradiction because either something is RNAV or is RMP. And the nav spec RMP AR approach. The FMS display, and Peter Bass, you can correct me if this is wrong. I think the FMS display is RMP 14 in such a case.
Good morning, everybody. Yes, it is possible, but for example, in Honeywell, it states RNAV RMP, so it is even more confusing.
Oh, okay. So, but at least it was the same as a chart title then, right?
As the chart title originally was, but now it is not that anymore.
Now it's
yeah. So
we're getting into that in a little bit later. With the old convention, a lot of confusion because of the unstandardized naming between chart, nav spec, and display. And we will also see that we will not address all of this with the new naming convention. There will still be some issues. And as Peter says, now in the Honeywell, you said, right, this was RNAV or RNV RMP on the display, so congruent with the chart title, but now we're changing then the chart title and the display will not change. You know, that's not something that happens so easily. Anyway, the first step that was done by ICAO, and namely the Instrument Flight Procedures panel, was to say we should clarify a little bit by using an information box, which we call PBN requirements box, that goes into the plan view of the chart. That was the first step. We have an RNAV GNSS runway 14, and the nav spec is RMP approach. This could be it in the PBN requirements box. It could be that you just state what is the nav spec. If you have additional requirements, or if you mention requirements that are optional for the spec, they also go there. So it means if you want to do an RMP approach where parts of initial or intermediate or missed approach would use RF flags, you can do that. Then in this case, you need to put that requirement in the box. Now, of course, you need to be a little bit careful when you do that, because it would mean that you may limit the population of the people that can fly this particular approach. Just throwing things in there that are not part of the nav spec could be done for addressing a local need of some kind, but using this on a widespread basis at a big hub is not necessarily a good idea. In the future, we will, of course, see better equipment on board of modern aircraft, better capabilities, but that's a different topic. What does not necessarily belong into that box is maybe an issue we need to discuss. There is no need to put something in an RMP approach that says GNSS required. We know, everybody knows that. GNSS is the only viable nav sensor for an RMP approach. So you don't have to put GNSS required because it's part of nav spec. Also, something like VNAV required does not really make sense. Just provide an LNAV minimum, then people can fly either. In the new naming convention, we have this part covered also when you want to provide just an LNAV, VNAV minimum, but no LNAV. So that's an important thing. Don't put anything in the PBN requirements box what does not belong there, because it confuses the pilots. They would be asking themselves, what does he want to tell me here? GNSS required? Other observed mistakes are say what you mean and mean what you say. If you, for example, on an RNAV1 SID, if you put GNSS required, but actually what you want to say is that DME is not allowed, you're not saying the right thing. Because if you say GNSS required, I will say, yeah, I have GNSS, and now I'll fly the bugger with DME. So say what you mean what you say. Very important. Other charting issues, which maybe have not directly to do with the topic of the naming, but it's something that we discussed last week in the flight validation pilots course, and actually does have to do quite a bit with performance-based navigation, is because PBN typically is flown from the FMS. An example like this one, where of course the designer probably wanted to avoid a obstacle somewhere here by reducing the speed and imposing a higher bank angle than the standard 15 degrees that you would use in the design. This note actually is difficult for the pilot to comply with because he has absolutely no control over the bank angle that is commanded by the system. So the only way he can comply with that requirement is decouple and fly it by hand. Is that something you want to do in an airline, Peter?
That's not going to happen.
You heard him. And hence, be careful with restrictions where the system cannot really comply with. Hand-flown environments in PBN, I don't think so.
Here I have to interrupt to give you an information that I was only made available a little bit after the webinar. It looks like Boeing aircraft still have the capability to actually control the bank angle by the crews. However, it doesn't seem to be something that is done, and is not something that the pilots do like, but the capability is there. So what we say in the film about the non-capability and the crews having no control about the bank angle is certainly true for Airbus aircraft.
That was the additional chart notes, which of course also have a little bit of an issue with cluttering. That means we put more information on the charts, which as a result may then be cluttered quite a bit. But this is something that the people who produce the charts have to be careful. That means trade off information that is relevant with packing every bloody thing on the chart that may not be relevant. So be careful with the PBN requirements box. Don't put things in there which are implicit. People are not necessarily stupid and cannot go and figure out what a nav spec is. So you don't have to repeat the whole requirements of the NAVs, just say what nav spec it is. Good, which brings us to the change. The IFPP at some point then had the idea to say we should probably make a change now because more and more there's feedback from the industry, mainly from the operations, that it becomes confusing with all these possible line of minima, LNAV, LNAV, VNAV, LPV, LP. The title is RNAV, GNSS, and we're flying RMP approach nav spec. The first attempt was to say, let's do a coordinated approach with the whole industry and see that avionics manufacturers also change. The problem is for them that if they change their interface, usually means that it is quite costly. So they're quite reluctant to change something, but if you want to let them change something, you need to give them time. And we said, let's change to a convention where the name reflects the nav spec, or at least the type of nav spec, whether it's an RNAV or an RMP. But in order for the whole industry to comply with, we need to give a time frame until 2028. That was the original intention or decision. I think the decision taken is some years back. I can't remember, but I think it's maybe 4, if not more years back when the decision, maybe 6, if not more, when the decision was taken. And then it went through the whole process of updating an ICAO PANS, which means, first of all, presentation to the Air Navigation Commission, and then after that state letter period, comments from the state. One thing was then that the Air Navigation Commission said, I'm not sure based on which decision or evidence, they said 2028, way too long. You need to put some pressure on the industry. Let's make a date, 2022. So it was decided to change that date to 2022 rather than keep it 2028, because they said otherwise they will wait until 2027 before they do something. And of course, that was the two possibility was what we called at the time a big bang change, that is on January 1st, 2028, everything changes, or you change gradually. The problem was that every state would be deciding that for themselves, and you would be in a mixed mode in terms of charting names. Now, guess what? We will be in a mixed mode of charting names for a couple of years. But anyway, 2022 was then the first decision that came out with one of the PANSOPS amendments. And again, the idea was to name an RMP approach, RMP runway 14, still keep the PBN requirements box, state the final approach nav spec. Now, of course, in the future, we could have 2 nav specs in there. If you use ARMP as well there, you cannot use ARMP for final approach, at least not after the revised PBN manual. So you would need RMP approach for the final, you use ARMP for the rest. So you have 2 specs there. The AR, of course, was also changed. And here the title would change to RMP runway 14 brackets AR. And then PBN requirements box as RMP AR approach. And then you would have to put any optional parts of the nav specs, which could be RMP 0.3 required in the missed approach, or you could also then put something that is required to comply with the option, like dual GNSS IRU required, if that's not implicit. So this is the chapter in PANSOPS that you see today, right? In part 3, section 5, chapter 1, for RMP approach, it says 1st December 2022 charge the pitting procedures that meet the RMP approach nav spec criteria shall include the term RMP in the identification, and the identification shall also include a parenthetical suffix when exceptional conditions occur as described in table 3511. Personally, I'm not a big fan of parenthetical suffixes in titles because they cannot be reflected by avionics anyway. And as you can see, you could have a suffix saying LPV only, meaning there's an LPV only line of minimum, no LNAV, no LNAV, VNAV. Why you need to put that in the title, I don't know. I was part of the discussions. I can still not understand. It was decided. Period. So same thing for LNAV, VNAV only, and then it gets weird when you put LPV, LNAV, VNAV only, just because you have no LNAV. If we put that parenthetical, why don't we put the shortest possible? Because if you have an LPV and an LNAV, VNAV minimum only, you could say the same with less letters by saying no LNAV. But hey, okay, let's not open the discussion again. Here we are. That's the convention, right? A lot of guerrilla actions in the background when this came out as an amendment relatively quickly. There was all of a sudden there were guerrilla actions trying to revert the decision, which is weird because if a decision like this is published as an amendment to PANS Ops, it means it went to all member states of ICAO, and there was not sufficient pushback from the member states to do it, and hence it was amended. If then all of a sudden some countries are trying to sabotage the whole decision, it kind of puts the ICAO system ad absurdum. But there were some guerrilla movements in the background to say, let's not do this, we need to go back to the old system, which we all know it's crap. But you could, of course, argue, say, at least it was understood after a while, and now we're changing, now nobody understands it. I don't think it's so difficult to understand, but that's another question. Point is that the US immediately said, we're not changing, this is too expensive. We have so many procedures that we need to change the charts for. We're not doing it. So there was some actions trying to get rid of the decision, and ICAO then stepped in and said, no, let's do it. Let's not leave it to everybody on their own. We need to orchestrate that from the ICAO point of view, and we will do that on a regional basis. And then the regional offices were tasked to come up with a transition plan. Now, I quickly went to all the regional office websites. The only transition plan that I could find right away was the one from the EURNAT office, but I'm sure the other ones have it hidden somewhere in their documentation as well. So they have a transition plan. This is going to go beyond 2022, but at least there is a plan. So there are certain countries, certain groups of countries that will change together. Some of you have already changed. Some of you have not changed yet or are just in the process of changing. The problem with this change is going to keep us busy maybe for a while because there's a couple of things we need to be aware of. Cockpit side, the FMS, FMCs, they will not change for many years. If they will change at all, that's the other question. Maybe they will say, nah, we're happy with the way it was. There is no uniform way, as we heard from Peter before, there is no uniform way that systems on board actually show the names of the charts anyway. So it's different from product to product, because that's an unstandardized area. What is obviously a little bit critical now is that you have crews flying from country where the change has already been made to a country where the change has not been made. We need to mitigate that with information and training. So we need to inform the pilots what this all is about. Another issue, as said, the USA, they are still convinced that they will not follow the change. They want to keep what they had before, and they released info letters, etc. about that. We will see how long they will resist. Obviously, they do have quite a lot of power in this regard, but that's also something that mainly pilots need to be aware of if they fly to the USA, that what they will be used to at some point flying in Europe or in Asia, where everything is going to be called RMP, runway XX, they fly to the US, it's still going to be RNAV GNSS or even RNAV GPS on their charts. This is something also we need to address through information and awareness in training. There's nothing else we can do about that. Then this one here is for procedure designers. Under the new naming convention, the clearance is RMP runway 14. So if you have to the same runway an RMP approach nav spec and then the procedure with AR nav spec, you need to be aware that they will have the same clearance if you don't put the duplicate procedure suffix. So if you have that, you need an RMP Zulu and an RMP Yankee, although one is RMP approach, the other is RMP AR. Otherwise, you cannot differentiate. Also, if then the display names are changed eventually, you could not differentiate either. That's important. Good. Another point, and that's basically the last point of the information that I'm giving, is be aware that if you want to do LPV and also LP, if you want to do both lines of minima, you cannot publish that on the same chart because the channel number is linked to a specific fast data block. You cannot have two channel numbers on the chart. So that also means you'd have to use a Zulu and a Yankee. So no LP, no LPV on the same chart. It's questionable anyway why you should publish an LP if you can publish an LPV, because typically the LPV is the much better procedure. The reason for LP was to be used in boundary regions of service volumes of SPAS areas. That means in areas where lateral is good enough, but vertical is not. Then you could do a non-vertically guided GNSS approach with SPAS augmentation, and that would be an LP line of minima. But it's not like an ILS or a lock only, where you put the lock only out as a backup when the glide path is out of use. That is a reason, and another one, but that would be very rare, I assume, is a procedure design reason, and that is the LPV OAS surfaces would pick up obstacles that you can get rid of in an LP with a step-down fix, and then you have a more favorable minimum on the LP than you have on the LPV. I would assume this can only occur in a case where you use APV1 performance for the SPAS. As soon as you're in the CAT1 environment, you can use the collision risk model, and I would be astonished if then LP returns a better minimum. Good. This was actually quicker than I thought. We could try. Maybe it's difficult with so many participants, but if anybody has any comment or question, we can do some 10 minutes interaction there.
If I may add something, Beat, to the situation regarding FAA and charting, there was the RISC. I think it was in, it wasn't in Brussels. I can't remember where it was. There was somebody of the FAA who explained the FAA is not going to change to the ICAO naming convention because it's just too costly. They have numbers of procedures, and with that, it doesn't make sense. In my opinion, it would be great if they would only change already the RNAV RMP, because this is now very unclear what it means. And if they would only change those, and I think there are just 400 or so, or maybe a little bit more, but then it's easier to manage, and you would then get rid of the situation of unambiguous names. My 5 cents.
Thanks, Peter. Any other votes from the world?
Hi, Bit. This is Silver from Estonia.
Hi, Silver.
Hi. I have a question about chart naming. We have a current situation that we have RMP procedures published, and now we are designing new procedures RMP for helicopters, which have a lower procedure altitude. What is the best way to name the new helicopter chart? Do we need to add Yankee and Zulu, or is it something different with what we can do?
Yeah, you're going to the same runway?
Yes, the same runway. Yeah. Both are straight-in procedures, so the helicopter is not pittance.
Yeah, you name it Yankee, Zulu. Use the suffix. That's the only thing you can do.
Okay, yeah.
Because also it's not, you're not supposed to publish helicopter procedures on the same chart as fixed wing. As soon as you have the same title, that would result from the design, even if it's two totally different things, you have to use a suffix, because otherwise, if all these procedures are in the database, you cannot find them, you cannot identify them, which is which. So yeah, use the suffix and you're fine.
Okay, but is there an option to put 0 before the runway identificator? I mean, if it's runway 26 and then we put runway 026, is that?
Oh, that's not necessary if you're going to the runway, because this, if you do this,
yes,
this is a pins. So this title is a pins title.
Okay, so it's not applicable for
no. Okay. If you're going to a runway, it's going to be. Have you changed already? I assume it's going to be RMP. It's going to be RMP. Start again. RMP, and then suffix. Runway. Whatever. Mm-hmm. Or you can then put underneath. Maybe is cat age only or something.
Okay.
You put that under the title or something, or you put them in the requirements box. I mean, but this information could be helpful on the chart somewhere in a prominent location. But
Okay.
but the naming for pins is a different story. So the naming for pins does not use this, right?
Yeah, so we cannot mix them up. Okay.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you for that.
Anybody else?
I guess my dog wanted to ask something.
Good. If there are no votes, I hope you found this useful. By the way, I recorded the session. It's only the speaker is visible in the video as a very small thing. I will probably then pep it up a little bit and also put it on YouTube, which, if you're not aware that there is a YouTube channel, check it out. There's some helpful information about holding construction and racetrack construction, series of 5 videos. And I will put it there. I think this is also something I could get used to on a regular basis, let's say. If I can think of a topic which can be covered, let's say if a burning topic shows up and we can cover that with an hour or maybe 1.5, I intend to do this more often because I quite like to use these instruments to spread information that everybody knows about, but maybe doesn't have the historical background where it's coming from. So if there are no further votes from the floor, I will end this and wish you a very nice day or evening, whatever your time zone is. Thanks for joining. See you next time. Over and out.
All right, that was it. I hope you found this useful. Thanks for watching it. See you next time. Bye bye.